Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of Rays of Folly Podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. And you can support the channel on Local, Subscribe Star, and buy me a coffee. So today's episode is a return to H.P. Lovecraft. I'm going to read, not in one session, probably two. I don't think we'll need three, but probably two. His wonderful essay on supernatural horror and literature. So, of course, Lovecraft is generally seen as a materialist. He was self-professed as an atheist. So, of course, depending on which works you read of his, you can find some spiritual elements. Good example would be Through the Gate with the Silver Key. A lot of his monsters and scary stuff are material. They're some organism from outer space. This is his summary of work from its inception in the 18th century up to his own day of what we would call supernatural, ghosts, ghouls, things like that. And it's a really good introduction to the genre, and you're going to be introduced to a lot of really interesting authors. So I am going to read this for today and probably next week as well. So here we go. Supernatural Horror and Literature by H.P. Lovecraft. Introduction. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. These facts few psychologists will dispute, and their admitted truth must establish for all time the genuineness and dignity of the weirdly horrible tale as a literary form. Against it are discharged all the shafts of materialist sophistication, which clings to frequently felt emotions and external events, and of a naively insipid idealism, which deprecates the aesthetic motive and calls for a didactic literature to uplift the reader toward a subtle degree of smirking optimism. But in spite of all this opposition, the weird tale survived, developed and attained remarkable heights of perfection, founded as it is on a profound and elementary principle whose appeal, if not always universal, must necessarily be poignant and permanent to minds of the requisite sensitiveness. The appeal of these spectrally macabre is generally narrow because it demands from the reader a certain degree of imagination and capacity for detachment from everyday life. Relatively few are free enough from the spell of the daily routine to respond to rappings from outside, and tales of ordinary feeling and events, or of common sentimental distortions of such feelings and events, will always take first place in the taste of the majority. Rightly, perhaps, since, of course, those ordinary matters make up the greater part of human experience. But the sensitive are always with us, and sometimes a certain streak of fancy invades an obscure corner of the very hardest head, so that no amount of rationalization, reform, or Freudian analysis can quite annul the thrill of the chimney corner whisper or the lonely wood. There is here involved a psychological pattern or tradition as real and as deeply grounded in mental experience as any other pattern or tradition of mankind, coeval with the religious feeling and closely related to many aspects of it, and too much a part of our innermost biological heritage to lose keen potency over a very important, though not numerically great, minority of our species. Man's first instincts and emotions formed his response to the environment in which he found himself. Definite feelings based on pleasure and pain grew up around the phenomena whose causes and effects he understood, whilst around those which he did not understand, and the universe teemed with them in these early days, were naturally woven such personifications, marvelous interpretations, and sensations of awe and fear as would be hit upon by a race having few and simple ideas and limited experience. The unknown, being likewise the unpredictable, became for our primitive forefathers a terrible and omnipotent source of boons and calamities visited upon mankind for cryptic and wholly extraterrestrial reasons, and thus clearly belonging to a sphere of existence whereof we know nothing and wherein we have no part. The phenomena of dreaming likewise helped to build up the notion of an unreal or spiritual world, and in general all the conditions of savage dawn life so strongly conducted toward a feeling of the supernatural that we need not wonder at the thoroughness with which man's very hereditary essence has become saturated with religion and superstition. That saturation must, as a matter of plain scientific fact, be regarded as virtually permanent so far as the subconscious mind and inner instincts are concerned. For though the area of the unknown has been steadily contracting for thousands of years, an infinite reservoir of mystery still engulfs most of the outer cosmos, whilst a vast residuum of powerful inherited associations clings around all the objects and processes that were once mysterious, however well they may now be explained. And more than this, there is an actual physiological fixation of the old instincts in our nervous tissues, which would make them obscurely operative even were the conscious mind to be purged of all sources of wonder. Because we remember pain and the menace of death more vividly than pleasure, and because our feelings toward the beneficent aspects of the unknown have from the first been captured and formalized by conventional religious rituals, it has fallen to the lot of the darker and more maleficent side of the cosmic mystery to figure chiefly in our popular supernatural folklore. This tendency, too, is naturally enhanced by the fact that uncertainty and danger are always closely allied, thus making any kind of an unknown world a world of peril and evil possibilities. When to this sense of fear and evil, the inevitable fascination of wonder and curiosity is superadded, there is born a composite body of keen emotion and imaginative provocation, whose vitality must of necessity endure as long as the human race itself. Children will always be afraid of the dark, and men with minds sensitive to hereditary impulse will always tremble at the thought of the hidden fathoms of worlds' strange life, which may pulsate in the gulfs beyond the stars, or press hideously upon our globe in unholy dimensions, which only the dead and the moonstruck can glimpse. With this foundation, no one need wonder at the existence of a literature of cosmic fear. It has always existed and always will exist, and no better evidence of its tenacious vigor can be cited than the impulse which now and then drives writers of totally opposite leanings to try their hands at it in isolated tales, as if to discharge from their minds certain phantasmal shapes which would otherwise haunt them. Thus Dickens wrote several eerie narratives, Browning the hideous poem Childe Roland, Henry James, The Turn of the Screw, Dr. Holmes, the subtle novel Elise Venner, F. Marion Crawford, The Yellow Wallpaper, whilst the humorist W. W. Jacobs produced that able melodramatic bit called The Monkey's Paw. This type of fear literature must not be confounded with the type of externally similar but psychologically widely different, the literature of mere physical fear and the mundanely gruesome. Such writing, to be sure, has its place, as has the conventional or even whimsical or humorous ghost story, where formalism or the author's knowing wink removes the true sense of the morbidly unnatural, but these things are not the literature of cosmic fear in its purest sense. The true weird tale has something more than secret murder, bloody bones, or a sheeted form clanking chains according to rule. A certain atmosphere of breathlessness and unexplained dread of outer unknown forces must be present, and there must be a hint expressed with a seriousness and portentousness becoming its subject of that most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space. Naturally, we cannot expect all weird tales to conform absolutely to any theoretical model. Creative minds are uneven, and the best of fabrics have their dull spots. Moreover, much of the choicest weird work is unconscious, appearing in memorable fragments scattered through material whose massed effect may be a very different cast. Atmosphere is the all-important thing, for the final criterion of authenticity is not the dovetailing of a plot, but the creation of a given sensation. We may say as a general thing that a weird story whose intent is to teach or produce a social effect, or one in which the horrors are finally explained away by natural means, is not a genuine tale of cosmic fear, but it remains a fact that such narratives often possess, in isolated sections, atmospheric touches which fulfill every condition of true supernatural horror literature. Therefore, we must judge a weird tale not by the author's intent or by the mere mechanics of the plot, but by the emotional level which it attains at its least mundane point. If the proper sensations are excited, such a high spot must be admitted on its own merits as weird literature, no matter how prosaically its ladder dragged down. The one test of the really weird is simply this: whether or not there be excited in the reader a profound sense of dread and of contact with unknown spheres and powers, a subtle attitude of awed listening, as if for the beating of black wings or the scratching of outside shapes and entities on the known universe's uttermost rim. And of course, the more completely and unifiedly a story conveys this atmosphere, the better it is a work of art as a genuine medium. The dawn of the horror tale. As may naturally be expected, of a form so closely connected with primal emotion, the horror tale is as old as human thought and speech themselves. Cosmic horror appears as an ingredient of the earliest folklore of all races and is crystallized in the most archaic ballads, chronicles, and sacred writings. It was indeed a prominent feature of the elaborate ceremonial magic with its rituals for the evocation of demons and specters, which flourished from prehistoric times and which reached its highest development in Egypt and the Semitic religions. Fragments of the Book of Enoch and the Clavicle of Solomon well illustrate the power of a weird over the ancient mind, the Eastern mind, and upon such things were based enduring systems and traditions whose echoes extend obscurely even to the present time. Touches of this transcendent fear are seen in classic literature, and there is evidence of its greater emphasis in ballad literature, which paralleled the classic stream but vanished for lack of a written medium. The Middle Ages, steeped in fanciful darkness, gave it an enormous impulse toward expression, and East and West alike were busy preserving and amplifying by the dark heritage, both of random folklore and of academically formulated magic and Kabbalism, which had descended to them. Witch, werewolf, vampire, and ghoul brooded ominously on the lips of bard and grandam, and needed but little encouragement to take the final step across the boundary that divides the chanted tale or song from the formal literary composition. In the Orient, the weird tale tended to assume a gorgeous coloring and sprightliness, which almost transmuted it into sheer fantasy. In the West, where the mystical Teuton had come down from the black boreal forests, and the Celt re-emerged strange sacrifices in druidic groves, it assumed a terrible intensity and convincing seriousness of atmosphere, which doubled the force of its half-told, half-hinted horrors. Much of the power of Western horror lore was undoubtedly due to the hidden, but often suspected presence of a hideous cult of nocturnal worshippers whose strange customs descended from pre-Aryan and pre-agricultural times when a squat race of Mongoloids roved over Europe with their flocks and herds, were rooted in the most revolting fertility rites of immemorial antiquity. This secret religion, stealthily handed down amongst peasants for thousands of years, despite the outward reign of the Druidic, Greco-Roman, and Christian faiths in the regions involved, is marked by wild witches' sabbaths in lonely woods and atop distant hills on Walpurgis Night and Halloween, the traditional breeding seasons of the goats and sheep and cattle, and became the source of vast riches of sorcery legend, besides provoking extensive witchcraft prosecutions, of which the Salem affair forms the chief American example. Akin to it in essence, and perhaps connected with it in fact, was the frightful secret system of inverted theology, or Satan worship, which produced such horrors as the famous Black Mass. Whilst operating toward the same end, we may note the activities of those whose aims were somewhat more scientific or philosophical, the astrologers, Kabbalists, and alchemists of the Albert Magnus or Raymond Lully type, with whom such rude ages invariably abound. The prevalence and depth of the medieval horror spirit in Europe, intensified by the dark despair which waves of pestilence brought, may be fairly gauged by the grotesque carvings slyly introduced into much of the finest later Gothic ecclesiastical work of the time. The demoniac gargoyles of Notre Dame and Mont Saint-Michel being among the most famous specimens. And throughout the period, it must be remembered, there existed amongst educated and uneducated alike a most unquestioning faith in every form of the supernatural, from the gentlest of Christian doctrines to the monstrous morbidities of witchcraft and black magic. It was from no empty background that the Renaissance magicians and alchemists, Nostradamus, Trithemius, Dr. Don Dee, and Robert Flood, and the like were born. In this fertile soil were nourished types and characters of somber myth and legend which persist in weird literature to this day, more or less disguised or altered by modern technique. The shade which appears and demands the burial of its bones, the demon lover who comes to bear away his still living bride, the death fiend or psychopomp riding the night wind, the man wolf, the sealed chamber, the deathless sorcerer. All these may be found in that curious body of medieval lore, which the late Mr. Baring Gould so effectively assembled in book form. Wherever the mystic northern blood was strongest, the atmosphere of the popular tales becomes more intense. For in the Latin races, there is a touch of basic rationality which denies to even the strangest superstitions many of the overtones of glamour so characteristic of our own forest-born and ice-fostered whisperings. Just as all fiction first found extensive embodiment in poetry, so it is in poetry that we first encounter the permanent entry of the weird into standard literature. Most of the ancient instances, curiously enough, are in prose, as the werewolf incident in Petronius, the gruesome passages in Apuleius, the brief but celebrated letter of Pliny the Younger to Sura, and the odd compilation on wonderful events by Emperor Hadrian's Greek freedman Phlegon. It is in Phlegon that we first find the hideous tale of the corpse bride, Philonon and Machates, later related by Proclus and in modern times forming the inspiration of Goethe's Bride of Corinth and Washington Irving's German Student. But by the time the old northern myths take literary form, and in that latter time when the weird appears as a steady element in the literature of the day, we find it mostly in metric dress, as indeed we find the greater part of the strictly imaginative writing of the Middle Ages and Renaissance. The Scandinavian Eddas and sagas thunder with cosmic horror and shake with the stark fear of Ymir and his shapeless spawn, whilst our own Anglo-Saxon Beowulf and the later continental Nibelung tales are full of eldritch weirdness. Dante is a pioneer in the classic capture of macabre atmosphere, and in Spenser's stately stanzas will be seen more than a few touches of fantastic terror in landscape, incident, and character. Prose literature gives us Mallory's Morte d'Arthur, in which we are presented many ghastly situations taken from early ballad sources. The theft of the sword and silk from the corpse in Chapel Perilous by Sir Lancelot, the ghost of Sir Gawain, and the tomb fiend seen by Sir Galahad. Whilst other and cruder specimens were doubtless set forth in the cheap and sensational chapbooks, vulgarly hawked about and devoured by the ignorant. An Elizabethan drama with its Dr. Faustus, the witches in Macbeth, the ghost in Hamlet, and the horrible gruesomeness of Webster, we may easily discern the stronghold of the demoniac on the public mind, a hold intensified by the very real fear of living witchcraft, whose terrors, first wildest on the continent, began to echo loudly in English ears as the witch-hunting crusades of James I gained headway. To the lurking mystic prose of the ages is added a long line of treatises on witchcraft and demonology, which aid in exciting the imagination of the reading world. Through the 17th and into the 18th century, we behold a growing mass of fugitive, legendary, and balladry of darksome cast, still, however, held down beneath the surface of polite and accepted literature. Chapbooks of horror and weirdness multiplied, and we glimpse the eager interest of the people through the fragments like Defoe's Apparition of Mrs. Veal, a homely tale of a dead woman's specter visit to a distant friend, written to advertise covertly a badly selling theological disquisition on death. The upper orders of society were now losing faith in the supernatural and indulging in a period of classic rationalism. Then, beginning with the translations of Eastern tales in Queen Anne's reign, and taking definite form toward the middle of the century, comes the revival of romantic feeling, the era of new joy in nature, and in the radiance of past times, strange scenes, bold deeds, and incredible marvels. We feel it first in the poets whose utterances take on new qualities of wonder, strangeness, and shuddering. And finally, after the timid appearance of a few weird scenes in the novels of the day, such as Smollett's Adventures of Ferdinand, Count Fathom, the released instinct precipitates itself in the birth of a new school of writing, the Gothic school of horrible and fantastic prose fiction, long and short, whose literary posterity is destined to become so numerous and in many cases so resplendent in artistic merit. It is, when one reflects upon it, genuinely remarkable that weird narration as fixed and academically recognized literary form should have been so late of final birth. The impulse and atmosphere are as old as man, the typical weird tale of standard literature is a child of the 18th century. Part 3, the early Gothic novel. The shadow-haunted landscapes of Ossian, the chaotic visions of William Blake, the grotesque witch dances in Burns' Tam O'Shanter, the sinister daemonism of Coleridge's Christabel and Ancient Mariner, the ghastly charm of James Hogg's Kilmeny, and the most restrained approaches to cosmic horror and Lamia, and many of Keats's other poems are typical British illustrations of the advent of the weird to formal literature. Our Teutonic cousins on the continent were equally receptive to the rising flood, and Burger's Wild Huntsman and the even more famous Demon Bridegroom Ballad of Laronne both imitated English by Scott, whose respect for the supernatural was always great, are only a taste of the eerie wealth which German song had commenced to provide. Thomas Moore adapted from such sources the legend of Ghoulish Bride, later used by Prosper Mérimée in the Venus of Ely, and traceable back to great antiquity, which echoes so shiveringly in his Ballad of the Ring, whilst Goethe's deathless masterpiece Faust, crossing from mere balladry into the classic cosmic tragedy of the ages, may be held as the ultimate height to which this German poetic impulse rose. But it will remain for a very sprightly and worldly Englishman, none other than Horace Walpole himself, to give the growing impulse definite shape and become the actual founder of the literary horror story as a permanent form. Fond of medieval romance and a mystery as a dilettante's diversion, and with a quaintly imitated Gothic castle as his abode at Strawberry Hill, Walpole in 1764 published The Castle of Otranto, a tale of the supernatural which, though thoroughly unconvincing and mediocre in itself, was destined to exert an almost unparalleled influence on the literature of the weird. First venturing it on as a translation by one William Marshall Gent from the Italian of a mythical Onoferio Moralto, the author later acknowledged his connection with the book and took pleasure in its wide and instantaneous popularity, a popularity which extended to many editions, even dramatization, and wholesale imitation both in England and in Germany. The story, tedious, artificial, and melodramatic, is further impaired by a brisk and prosaic style whose urbane sprightliness nowhere permits the creation of a truly weird atmosphere. It tells of Manfred, an unscrupulous and usurping prince determined to found a line, who, after the mysterious sudden death of his only son Conrad on the latter's bridal morn, attempts to put away his wife, Hippolyta, and wed the lady destined for the unfortunate youth, the lad, by the way having been crushed by the preternatural fall of a gigantic helmet in the castle courtyard. Isabella, the widowed bride, flees from his design and encounters in subterranean crypts beneath the castle a noble young preserver, Theodore, who seems to be a peasant yet strangely resembles the old Lord Alfonso, who ruled the domain before Manfred's time. Shortly therefore, supernatural phenomena assail the castle in diverse ways, fragments of a gigantic armor being discovered here and there, a portrait walking out of its frame, the thunderclap destroying the edifice, and a colossal armored specter of Alfonso rising out of the ruins to ascend through the parting clouds to the bosom of St. Nicholas. Therefore, having wooed Manfred's daughter Matilda and lost her through death, for she is slain by her father by mistake, is discovered to be the son of Alfonso and rightful heir to the estate. He concludes the tale by wedding Isabella and preparing to live happily ever after, whilst Manfred, whose usurpation was the cause of his son's supernatural death, and his own supernatural harassings, retires to a monastery for penitence, his saddened wife seeking asylum in a neighboring convent. Such is the tale, flat, silted, and altogether devoid of the true cosmic horror, which makes weird literature. Yet such was the thirst of the age for these touches of strangeness and spectral antiquity which it reflects, that it was seriously received by the soundest readers and raised in spite of its intrinsic ineptness to a pedestal of lofty importance in literary history. What it did above all else was to create a novel type of scene, puppet characters, and incidents, which, handled to better advantage by writers more naturally adapted to weird creation, stimulated the growth of an imitative Gothic school, which in turn inspired the real weavers of cosmic terror, the line of actual artists beginning with Poe. This novel dramatic paraphernalia consisted, first of all, of the Gothic castle with its awesome antiquity, vast distances and ramblings, deserted of ruined wings, damp corridors, unwholesome hidden catacombs, and galaxy of ghosts and appalling legends is the nucleus of suspense and demoniac fright. In addition, it included the tyrannical and malevolent nobleman as the villain, the saintly, long persecuted, and generally insipid heroine who undergoes the major terrors and serves as a point of view and focus for the reader's sympathies. The valorous and immaculate hero, always of high birth but often in humble disguise. The convention of a high-sounding foreign names, mostly Italian, for the characters and the infinite array of stage properties, which includes strange lights, damp trapdoors, extinguished lamps, moldy hidden manuscripts, creaking hinges, shaking auras, and the like. All of this paraphernalia reappears with this amusing sameness, yet sometimes with tremendous effect throughout the history of the Gothic novel, and is by no means extinct even today, though subtler technique now forces it to assume a less naive and obvious form. An harmonious milieu for a new school has been found, and the writing world was not slow to grasp the opportunity. German romance at once responded to the Walpole influence and soon became a byword for the weird and ghastly. In England, one of the first imitators was the celebrated Mrs. Barbald, then Miss Aiken, who in 1773 published an unfinished fragment called Sir Bertrand, in which the strings of genuine terror were truly touched with no clumsy hand. A nobleman on a dark and lonely moor, attracted by a tolling bell, and distant light, enters a strange and ancient turreted castle whose doors open and close and whose bluish will-o'-the-wisps lead up mysterious staircases toward dead hands and animated black statues. A coffin with a dead lady whom Sir Bertrand kisses is finally reached, and upon the kiss, the scene dissolves to give place to a splendid apartment where the lady restored to life holds a banquet in honor of her rescuer. Walpole admired this tale, though he accords less respect to an even more prominent offspring of his Entranto, The Old English Baron by Clara Reeve, published in 1777. Truly enough, this tale lacks the real vibration to the note of outer darkness and mystery which distinguishes Mrs. Barbald's fragment, and though less crude than Walpole's novel and more artistically economical of horror in its possession of only one spectral figure, and is nevertheless too definitely insipid for greatness. Here again we have the virtuous heir to the castle disguised as a peasant and restored to his heritage to the ghost of his father, and here again we have a case of a wide popularity leading to many editions, dramatizations, and ultimate translation into French. Miss Reeve wrote another weird novel, unfortunately unpublished and lost. The Gothic novel was now settled as a literary form, and instances multiply bewilderingly as the 18th century draws towards its close. The Recess, written in 1785 by Miss Sophia Lee, has the historic element revolving around the two daughters of Mary, Queen of Scots, and though devoid of the supernatural, employs the Walpole scenery and mechanism with great dexterity. 5 years later, and all existing lamps are paled by the rising of a fresh luminary, of whose superior order Miss Anne Radcliffe, 1764 to 1823, whose famous novels made terror and suspense a fashion, and who set new and higher standards in the domain of macabre and fear-inspiring atmosphere, despite a provoking custom of destroying her own phantoms at the last through labored mechanical explanations. To the familiar Gothic trappings of her predecessors, Miss Radcliffe added a genuine sense of the unearthly in scene and incident which closely approached genius, every touch of setting and action contributing artistically to the impression of illimitable frightfulness, which she wished to convey. A few sinister details, like a track of blood on castle stairs, a groan from a distant vault, or a weird song in a nocturnal forest, can, with her, conjure up the most powerful images of imminent horror, surpassing by far the extravagant and toilsome elaborations of others. Nor are these images in themselves any the less potent, because they are explained away before the end of the novel. Mrs. Radcliffe's visual imagination was very strong and appears as much in her delightful landscape touches, always in broad, glamorously pictorial outline, and never in close detail as in her weird fantasies. Her prime weakness, aside from the habit of prosaic disillusionment, are a tendency toward erroneous geography and history, and a fatal predilection for bestrewing her novels with insipid little poems attributed to one or other of the characters. Mrs. Radcliffe wrote 6 novels, The Castle of Athlin and Dunebane, 1789, A Sicilian Romance, 1790, The Romance in the Forest, 1791, The Mysteries of Udolpho, 1794, The Italian, 1797, and Guston de Boldonville, composed in 1802, but first published posthumously in 1826. Of these, Udolpho is by far the most famous, and we may be taken as a type of the early Gothic tale at its best. It is the chronicle of Emily, a young Frenchwoman transplanted to an ancient and portentous castle in the Apennines. Through the death of her parents and the marriage of her aunt to the lord of the castle, the scheming nobleman Montoni. Mysterious sounds, open doors, frightful legends, and a nameless horror in a niche behind a black veil all operate in quick succession to unnerve the heroine and her faithful attendant Annette. But finally, after the death of her aunt, she escapes with the aid of a fellow prisoner whom she has discovered. On the way home, she stops at a chateau filled with fresh horrors, the abandoned wing where the departed Chatelaine dwelt, and the bed of death with the black pall is fully restored to security and happiness with her lover Valancourt after the clearing up of a secret which seemed for a time to involve her birth and mystery. Clearly, this is only the familiar material reworked, but it is so well reworked that Udolpho will always be a classic. Mrs. Radcliffe's characters are puppets, but they are less markedly so than those of her forerunners. And in atmospheric creation, she stands preeminent among those of her time. Of Mrs. Radcliffe's countless imitators, the American novelist Charles Brockden Brown stands the closest in spirit and method. Like her, he injured his creations by natural explanations, but also like her, he had an uncanny atmospheric power which gives his horrors a frightful vitality, as long as they remain unexplained. He differed from her in contemptuously discarding the external Gothic paraphernalia and properties and choosing her modern American scenes for his mysteries. But this repudiation does not extend to the Gothic spirit and type of incident. Brown's novels involve some memorably frightful scenes and excel even Mrs. Radcliffe's in describing the operations of the perturbed mind. Edgar Huntley starts with a sleepwalker digging a grave, but is later impaired by touches of Godwinian didacticism. Ormond involves a member of a sinister secret brotherhood. That and Arthur Mervyn both describe the plague of yellow fever, which the author had witnessed in Philadelphia and New York. But Brown's most famous book is Wyland, or The Transformation, 1798, in which a Pennsylvania German, engulfed by a wave of religious fanaticism, hears voices and slays his wife and children as a sacrifice. His sister Clara, who tells the story, narrowly escapes. The scene laid at the woodland estates of Minningen on the Schuylkill's remote reaches is drawn with extreme vividness, and the terrors of Clara, beset by spectral tones, gathering fears, and the sound of strange footsteps in the lonely house, are all shaped with truly artistic force. In the end, a lame ventriloquist explanation is offered, but the atmosphere is genuine while it lasts. Carwin, the malign ventriloquist, is a typical villain of the Manfred or Montoni type. 4. The apex of the Gothic Renaissance. Horror in literature attains a new malignity in the work of Matthew George Lewis, 1775-1818, whose novel The Monk, 1796, achieved marvelous popularity and earned him the nickname of Monk Lewis. This young author, educated in Germany and saturated with a body of wild Teutonic lore unknown to Miss Radcliffe, turned to terror in forms more violent than his genteel predecessor had ever dared to think of, and produced as a result a masterpiece of active nightmare whose general Gothic cast is spiced with added stores of ghoulishness. The story is one of a Spanish monk, Ambrosio, whom from a state of overproud virtue is tempted to the very nadir of evil by a fiend in the guise of the maiden Matilda, and who is finally, when awaiting death at the Inquisition's hands, induced to purchase escape at the price of his soul from the devil, because he deems both body and soul already lost. Forthwith, the mocking fiend snatches him to a lonely place, tells him he has sold his soul in vain, since both pardon and a chance for salvation were approaching at the moment of his hideous bargain, and completes the sardonic betrayal by rebuking him for his unnatural crimes and casting his body down a precipice whilst his soul is borne off forever into perdition. The novel contains some appalling descriptions, such as the incantation in the vaults beneath the convent cemetery, the burning of the convent, and the final end of the wretched abbot. In the subplot where the Marquis de la Cisternas meets the specter of his erring ancestress, the Bleeding Nun, there are many enormously potent strokes, notably the visit of the animated corpse to the Marquis's bedside, and the Kabbalistic ritual whereby the wandering Jew helps him to fathom and banish his dead tormentor. Nevertheless, the monk drags sadly when read as a whole. It is too long and too diffuse, and much of its potency is marred by flippancy and by an awkwardly excessive reaction against those canons of decorum which Lewis at first despised as prudish. One great thing may be said of the author, that he never ruined his ghostly visions with a natural explanation. He succeeded in breaking up the Radcliffean tradition and expanding the field of the Gothic novel. Lewis wrote much more than The Monk. His drama, The Castle Spectre, was produced in 1798, and he later found time to pen other fictions in ballad form: Terror of Terror, 1799, Tales of Wonder, 1801, and a succession of translations from the German. Gothic romances, both English and German, now appealed in multitudinous and mediocre profusion. Most of them were merely ridiculous in the light of mature taste. And Miss Austen's famous satire, North Granger Abbey, was by no means an unmerited rebuke to a school which had sunk far toward absurdity. The particular school was petering out. But before its final subordination, there arose its last and greatest figure in the person of Charles Robert Maturin, 1782 to 1824, an obscure and eccentric Irish clergyman. Out of an ample body of miscellaneous writing, which includes one confused Radcliffean imitation called Fatal Revenge, or The Family of Montorio, 1807, Maturin at length evolved the vivid horror masterpiece of Melmoth the Wanderer, 1820, in which the Gothic tale climbed to altitudes of sheer spiritual fright which it has never known before. Melmoth is the tale of an Irish gentleman who in the 17th century obtained a preternaturally extended life from the devil at the price of his soul. If he can persuade another to take the bargain off his hands and assume his existing state, he can be saved. But this he can never manage to effect, no matter how assiduously he haunts those whom despair has made reckless and frantic. The framework of the story is very clumsy, involving tedious, length, digressive episodes, narratives within narratives, and laboring dovetailing and coincidences. But at various points in the endless rambling, there is felt a pulse of power undiscoverable in any previous work of this kind. A kinship to the essential truth of human nature, an understanding of the profoundest source of actual cosmic fear, and a white heat of sympathetic passion on the writer's part, which makes the book a true document of aesthetic self-expression rather than a mere clever compound of artifice. No unbiased reader can doubt that with Melmoth, an enormous stride in the evolution of the horror tale is represented. Fear is taken out of the realm of the conventional and exalted into a hideous cloud over mankind's very destiny. Maturin shudders the work of one capable of shuddering himself, art of the sort that conceive. Miss Radcliffe and Lewis are fair game for the parodist, but it would be difficult to find a false note in the feverishly intensified action and high atmospheric tension of the Irishman, whose less sophisticated emotions and strain of Celtic mysticism give him the finest possible natural equipment for the task. Without a doubt, Maturin is a man of authentic genius, and he was so recognized by Balzac, who grouped Melmoth with Moliere's Don Juan, Goethe's Faust, and Byron's Manfred as the supreme allegorical figures of modern European literature, and wrote a whimsical piece called Melmoth Reconciled, in which the wanderer succeeds in passing his infernal bargain onto a Parisian bank defaulter, who in turn hands it along a chain of victims until a reveling gambler dies with it in his possession, and by his damnation ends the curse. Scott, Rossetti, Thackeray, and Baudelaire are the other titans who gave Maturin their unqualified admiration. And there is much significance in the fact that Oscar Wilde, after his disgrace and exile, chose for his last days in Paris the assumed name of Sebastian Melmoth. Melmoth contains scenes which even now have not lost their power to evoke dread. It begins with a deathbed. An old miser is dying of sheer fright because of something he has seen, coupled with a manuscript he has read and a family portrait which hangs in an obscure closet on his centuried home in County Wicklow. He sends to Trinity College, Dublin, for his nephew John, and the latter, upon arriving, notes many uncanny things. The eyes of the portrait on the closet glow horribly, and twice a figure strangely resembling the portrait appears momentarily at the door. Dread hangs over that house of the Melmoths, one of whose ancestors, J. Melmoth, 1646, the portrait represents. The dying miser declares that this man, at a date slightly before 1800, is alive. Finally, the miser dies, and the nephew is told that the will to destroy both the portrait and a manuscript is to be found in a certain drawer. Reading the manuscript, which was written late in the 17th century by an Englishman named Stanton, young John learns of a terrible incident in Spain in 1677, where the writer met a horrible fellow countryman and was told of how he had stared to death a priest who tried to denounce him as one filled with fearsome evil. Later, after meeting the man again in London, Stanton is cast into a madhouse and visited by the stranger, whose approach is heralded by spectral music and whose eyes have a more than mortal glare. Melmoth the Wanderer, for such is the malign visitor, offers the captive freedom if he will take over his bargain with the devil. But like all others whom Melmoth has approached, Stanton is proof against temptation. Melmoth's description of the horrors of a life in a madhouse used to tempt Stanton is one of the most potent passages of the book. Stanton is at length liberated and spends the rest of his life tracking down Melmoth, whose family and ancestral abode he discovers. With the family he leaves the manuscript, which by young John's time is sadly ruinous and fragmentary. John destroys both portrait and manuscript, but in sleep is visited by his horrible ancestor, who leaves a black and blue mark on his wrist. Young John soon afterward receives as a visitor a shipwrecked Spaniard, Alonso de Moncada, who has escaped from compulsory monasticism and from the perils of the Inquisition. He has suffered horribly, and the descriptions of his experiences in torment and in the vaults through which he once essays escape are classic, but had the strength to resist Melmoth the Wanderer when approached at the darkest hour in prison. At the house of a Jew who sheltered him after his escape, he discovers a wealth of manuscripts relating other exploits of Melmoth, including his wooing of an Indian island maiden, Emale, who later comes to her birthright in Spain and is known as Donna Isidora, and of his horrible marriage to her by the corpse of a dead anchorite at midnight in the ruined chapel of a shunned and abhorred monastery. Moncada's narrative to young John takes up the bulk of Maturin's 4-volume book, this disproportion being considered one of the chief technical faults of the composition. At least the colloquies of John and Moncada are interrupted by the entrance of Melmoth the Wanderer himself, the piercing eyes now fading and decrepitude swiftly overtaking him. The term of his bargain has approached its end, and he has come home after a century and a half to meet his fate. Warning all others from the room, no matter what sounds there may hear in the night, he awaits the end alone. Young John and Moncada hear frightful ululations, but do not intrude till silence comes toward morning. Then they find the room empty. Clearly, footprints lead out a rear door to a cliff overlooking the sea, and near the edge of the precipice is a track indicating the forcible dragging of some heavy body. The Wanderer's scarf is found on a crag some distance below the brink, but nothing further is ever seen or heard of him. Such is the story, and none can fail to notice the difference between this modulated, suggestive, and artistically modeled horror, and, to use the words of Professor George Stainsbury, the artful but rather jejune rationalism of Mrs. Radcliffe, and the too often puerile extravagance, the bad taste, and sometimes slipshod style of Lewis. Maturin's style in itself deserves particular praise for its forcible directness and vitality, lifted altogether above the pompous artificialities of which his predecessors are guilty. Professor Edith Burkhead, in her History of the Gothic Novel, justly observes that with all his faults, Maturin was the greatest as well as the last of the Goths. Melmoth was widely read and eventually dramatized, and its late date in the evolution of the Gothic tale deprived it of the tumultuous popularity of Udolpho and the Monk. Okay, at this point, we will stop at section 5. And I'm glad everybody came in, and I hope you enjoyed the reading. Tune in next week for picking up part 5, the aftermath of Gothic fiction. It's Todd Lewis of the Praise of 5 podcast, signing off.